Today we'll be looking at chapters 21 through 26. There's an awful lot of material to cover in this class, and so I'll be only covering the highlights. But if you have any questions that I don't cover, you can do as others have done and send me a text or an email if you'd like me to discuss something I didn't address. Chapter 21, verses 17 beginning through verse 26. This is the third missionary journey from last week, and Paul has made his way back from this area over here, from Greece and Macedonia down to Tyre on his way to Jerusalem. And we have, beginning of verse 17 and following, Paul and those with him making their way south to Jerusalem down the seacoast here, as you see on the map. He met with James and the elders of the church once he got to Jerusalem. Paul gave a report regarding the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Those listening rejoiced, but they informed him of a bad sentiment towards him which had become prevalent. Some Jews had begun to represent Paul as an enemy of the law of Moses, and apparently lots of Jews who had become Christians were being influenced by this misrepresentation of Paul. So the elders suggested that Paul demonstrate that he had not become an enemy of the nation, nor had he become an opponent of Moses. They suggested that he participate with 4 men who had made a vow and who were going to the temple for purification. Paul agreed to do this, but it needs to be understood that he was merely participating in a Jewish custom. He was not giving the impression, nor was he teaching, that this custom was necessary for salvation. The vow these men had taken was probably the Nazirite vow found in Numbers chapter 6. In verse 25 of Acts chapter 21, the elders assured Paul that they were not suggesting that he do anything which would contradict God's will for either Jews or Gentiles. That was made clear by their statement. Verses 28 through 36, we see that after nearly a week had gone by without incident, some Jews from Asia, let me switch maps here. Some Jews from Asia, which would be this area over here. This is Jerusalem, Judea area down here where Paul is now. And some Jews from Asia recognized one of the Gentiles who was with Paul. His name was Trophimus, and he was from Ephesus, right here in Southwest Asia. And we're told that these Jews supposed that Paul had brought Trophimus into the temple, which would have been a desecration of the temple, an unlawful thing to do because he was a Gentile. When you're looking to find fault with someone, you often suppose a lot of things. They caused an uproar, they created a mob, and like all mobs, they resorted to violence, and they were intending to kill Paul. The Roman commander, who would have been stationed in the fortress of Antonia on the northwest corner of Jerusalem, came and rescued Paul to take him into the barracks for his own safety until he could determine what all the uproar was about. Verses 38, chapter 21, verse 38 through chapter 22, verse 21, this section has Paul speaking to the Roman commander and asking permission to address the crowd. He tells him that where he's from, which back here he tells him he's from Tarsus. He mentions he's from Cilicia, which is the region. And he asks permission to address the crowd, and the commander allows him to do so. Paul then speaks to the crowd in Hebrew, and this caused the crowd to go silent. He didn't speak to them in the Greek language, which was the universal language of the day. He didn't speak to them in the Aramaic language, which was the common language that the Jews spoke. Paul spoke to them in Hebrew. Hebrew was the chosen language of the scholars, and it was what was taught in the Jewish synagogues. The crowd would have been impressed that Paul began to speak in this language. It showed respect for the Jewish people. It showed respect for the law. Paul told of his conversion, and the crowd listened attentively until Paul told about the Lord's instructions and intention to send him to the Gentiles. Then they once again threatened Paul's life. Chapter 2, verses 22 through 29, the Roman commander decided to scourge Paul in order to try to determine what the riot was about. According to Roman law, it was unlawful to beat or to imprison a Roman citizen before giving him a fair trial. And so Paul asked the commander if it was lawful to scourge a Roman citizen who had not been tried or condemned. It was unusual that a Jew had Roman citizenship. Citizenship could be obtained only by being born in a free city or by having citizenship conferred by the Senate for deeds of merit or for money, or by inheriting your citizenship from a father who was a citizen. The commander acknowledged that he himself had purchased his citizenship, but Paul's citizenship was inherited from his father, which was more honorable. The commander became concerned because he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Also needs to be noted that the punishment for falsely claiming citizenship was so harsh that people didn't risk it. So anyone making this claim, it could be verified. It would be a process, but anyone making this claim, there would be a great chance that they were telling the truth. Chapter 22, verse 30 through chapter 23, verse 10, we later discover a little bit later in chapter 23, actually verse 26, that the commander's name was Claudius Lysias. And since he wanted to know what the accusations were against Paul, he commanded that the Sanhedrin meet to determine the charges against him, and they met on the next day. When they had convened, Paul immediately recognized that the council, of course, was made up of both Sadducees and Pharisees, and he took advantage of that for his benefit. He stated that he was on trial because of his hope of the resurrection from the dead. This was a cardinal point of opposition between these two groups, and it caused such a discord that the commander once again took Paul and brought him to the barracks for his own safety. Chapter 23, verses 11 through 35, the Jews who were determined to kill Paul now tried a different tactic. Verses 12 through 13 tell us that more than 40 Jews bound themselves under an oath that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. We know nothing more about Paul's sister or his sister's son, Paul's nephew, but verses 16 and following reveals that Paul's nephew heard about the plan to kill Paul. And he came and told Paul, then Paul had him to tell the commander. To his credit, the commander had Paul taken during the night about 65 miles northwest to Caesarea. See that on the map here from Jerusalem to Caesarea, but here's a bigger map too, actually. I put this one up here. I don't like all the colors there, but I did that for the mileage here from Jerusalem to Antipatris. Said to be 38 miles, but as I understand, they actually had to go down to the south here, reflected in this map. The roads, the way they went. And then from Antipatris on to Caesarea, another 26 miles, roughly called about 65 miles, probably a little longer than that as you had to travel. But Paul was escorted with a serious, quite impressive entourage here. We're told that there were 70 horsemen, 200 soldiers, and 200 spearmen, which is uncertain exactly what that means. But 470 men took him on the journey. Once they reached the first leg of the journey, when they got to Antipatris, instructions were given for the 400 foot soldiers to return to Jerusalem, and they did so. And then the 70 horsemen continued the journey on to Caesarea, which is up here on the seacoast. Chapters 24, 25, and 26 cover 3 trials respectively. Chapter 24 is Paul on trial before Felix. Chapter 25 is Paul on trial before Festus. Chapter 26 is Paul on trial before King Agrippa. Chapter 24, the first 23 verses, we're introduced to Felix. We met him a few verses near the end of chapter 23. But Felix was a wicked and unprincipled individual. The historian Tacitus wrote that, quote, with all cruelty and lust he exercised the power of a king with the spirit of a slave, end quote. Felix was living in an adulterous relationship with his second wife, Drusilla, whom we will meet at the end of this chapter. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who was stricken by God in Acts chapter 12. Felix was an experienced judge. He was well informed regarding Jewish matters and the Jewish religion. He was also well informed regarding Christianity, well enough not to be fooled by the lawyer Tertullus, who was the lawyer for the Jews, that they had brought in like a hired gun, if you will. Tertullus began by flattering Felix, and he leveled false charges against Paul, charges that he simply could not prove. Then Paul got up and merely stated that he was glad to, rather than pouring on the flattery, he stated that he was glad to have an experienced judge in matters relating to the Jews before whom he could present his defense. Paul then laid out the facts and disproved the charges against him. He made it clear that he had not broken Jewish law, nor had he broken Roman law. He pointed out that this was merely about his teaching on the resurrection. This was about a doctrinal issue. Felix saw what was going on, but not wanting to fall into disfavor with the Jews and not wanting to condemn an innocent Roman citizen, he simply postponed judgment on Paul. The last few verses of chapter 24, verses 24 through 27, is a section that's familiar to Bible students. After some time, Felix summoned Paul to speak before him and his wife Drusilla. We don't know if it was merely curiosity or if he had a sincere desire to know about the truth, but verse 24 says that Felix wanted Paul to speak about the faith in Christ. We're told that Paul spoke about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Felix was known for his cruelty, his greed, and his immorality. And so we're told that he became afraid and he merely procrastinated. Knowing that Paul was innocent, Felix hoped that money would be raised to secure his release from prison, but 2 years later, Felix was removed from office because of charges of misconduct, and he left Paul bound in prison in order to please the Jews. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 12, we see that Felix was then replaced by Festus. Josephus described Festus as wise, just, and agreeable. He was a better man than Felix, but he was a worse governor. He was naive regarding the devices of the Jews over whom he ruled. So we see Festus at the beginning of this chapter trying to court the favor of the Jews by asking Paul if he was willing to go to Jerusalem to be judged. Paul understood that the Jews just wanted to find a way to put him to death, and he realized that Festus was weak, so he exercised his lawful right as a Roman citizen, and he appealed to Caesar. The types of charges against Paul were of such a nature that if he appealed to Caesar as a Roman citizen, his appeal could not be denied. In verses 13 through 27, we're introduced to Herod Agrippa II, otherwise known as King Agrippa. He made the trip to Caesarea to congratulate Festus on his new appointment. Agrippa was regarded as an authority on Jewish beliefs. He'd been brought up in the Jewish religion. He also would have had knowledge about Jesus' crucifixion and about the claim of his resurrection. He would have been acquainted with the teachings of the apostles and with the growth of the church throughout the region. He was over the regions of Galilee and Perea, so he had no jurisdiction over Paul. Therefore, this was not really a trial, but Festus appreciated Agrippa's knowledge, and he wanted his opinion about Paul. Felix's wife Drusilla was Agrippa's younger sister. Agrippa himself was living at this time in an incestuous relationship with another one of his sisters, Bernice. This latter section of chapter 25 tells about Festus explaining to Agrippa the situation with Paul and requesting that Agrippa listen to Paul and help Festus know what to write when he had to send Paul to Rome. So we get into chapter 26, the first 18 verses. This chapter records Paul's trial before Agrippa. This is the third account of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. It's the second time Paul himself told his his conversion account. And with some details that we don't find in chapter 22, the previous account, a previous instance where he told of his conversion, the first 18 verses are Paul's retelling of his conversion story, again with more detail. In verses 19 through 32, Paul tells how he began preaching Christ after his conversion. He points out that the resurrection of Christ was foretold in the Old Testament. Festus then accuses Paul of being crazy, but Paul knows that Agrippa understood what he was saying, and when Paul challenged him, Agrippa made his famous statement, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." Agrippa recognized Paul's innocence, and he told Festus that if Paul had not appealed to Caesar, he might have been set free. Next week, we're going to look at, I just realized that I haven't had the map up. I don't think I've referred to it. No, it's sitting there. It's just not up where I can activate it on my end. Okay, that was nice. Next week, we'll look at chapters 27 and 28, which tell about Paul's voyage to Rome.